Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 5 things I've learned about the 1660s from reading the diary of Samuel Pepys. So I've actually been reading the diary of Samuel Pepys for 6 years now. Samuel Pepys kept a diary for 10 years from 1660 to the end of 1669. So for that decade, the 1660s. And it's an amazing resource for historians, people interested in the 17th century, particularly this period of restoration. And what I've been doing is I've been reading a week that corresponds with the week of that I'm in. So right now I'm in 1665 and I've been reading it since 1660. So every week I read another week of Samuel Pepys' diary in line with the dates that I'm living in. So it's quite interesting to see what was going on in those times. So I've got another few years to go before I finish it. But I thought I'd make this video just to run through some of the interesting things that I've learned about the 1660s from reading these diaries. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the diaries. If you don't know, it's really interesting. So Pepys wrote the diary in code. So if somebody kind of opened it up, they wouldn't be able to work out what was being written. And they were, after his death, they were put with all his papers and they sat there for quite a long time. And then the code was deciphered, if I remember correctly, in the Victorian period. But the full diaries weren't published until the 1960s, I think it was, because obviously there's quite a lot about relationships and being drunk and all of those things, so it wasn't quite appropriate for kind of Victorian England. So the full diary is published in the 1960s, and that's what I'm reading at the moment. Okay, so here we go. 5 things that I've learned about the 1660s from reading the diary of Samuel Pepys. The first thing is that there are real key kind of parallels to today, but there's also some key differences. So here is one from the year I'm currently on, 1665. Obviously, that's the plague year. And what we have here is Pepys in 7th September 1665 talking about reading the weekly bill of mortality. So this is the list of the causes of death in London for that week. And he's talking in September 1665 that almost 7,000 people, he says the most dreadful number, 6,878, the most dreadful number have died from the plague. And this is very similar to, if you think about in times of the pandemic and COVID, when we would look at the weekly death rates and see how many people had died of COVID. Very, very similar. And this kind of fear of the plague, and very, very similar kind of parallels there. So, and there's lots of other kind of key similarities. I'll come to some more in just a second. But here's a really significant difference that Samuel Pepys on the 13th of October 1660 talks about going to Charing Cross to see Major General Harrison hanged, drawn and quartered. Okay, and it says he was looking as cheerful as any man could do in that condition, which is quite surprising that he was looking a little bit cheerful despite just about to be publicly executed. And it says he was presently cut down and his head and heart shown to the people, at which there was great shouts of joy. It is said that he said that he was sure to come shortly to the right hand of Christ to judge them that now had judged him, and that his wife do expect his coming again. Thus it was my chance to see the king beheaded at Whitehall and to see the first bloodshed in revenge for the blood of the king at Charing Cross. So Pepys is talking about going to a public execution and holding up the head and the heart of Major General Harrison, who'd been involved in the regicide in 1649. And this is obviously a clear kind of difference, and also the fact there's shouts of joy at this. It suggests that this is, a common occurrence or something that people were kind of happy about. So quite different to today. So 1660s, some parallels, but some really clear differences. Another key thing that I've really picked up on from reading the diary of Samuel Pepys is just the scientific advancement. And Pepys was involved in the Royal Society and in Gresham College. And he talks about in January 1665 reading Robert Hooke's book, Micrographia. And he says it's the most ingenious book I've ever read in my life. So just being at the forefront of this kind of scientific advancement. Also in February 1665, in this one he's talking about going to see experiments. I think this one's actually about Gresham College, and he says this is about the nature of fire and how it goes out in a place where the air is not free, and the sooner out where the air is exhausted. So it's these public experiments and just kind of the inquisitive nature of people like Samuel Pepys, these kind of, as they were called at the time, kind of gentlemen scientists in the Royal Society, and in Gresham College. So it's really interesting, reading about this time of, the scientific revolution, and how ideas were changing about the world around them. The next point is that human nature was very similar. So there's lots in here about people getting drunk, having arguments, getting into fights, jokes. And this extract, I'm not going to read it all, but from 6th of January 1662, talks about Samuel Pepys' man Gull, who I think must be his servant. And he said he went to bed, he drank too much, his head ached. Samuel Pepys calls for him. He rose up and came to me, and Samuel Pepys kind of tells him off for being drunk. And then he says, but I do believe he is drunk too much, and so I did threaten him to bid his uncle depose of him in some other way, and sent him down to bed, and do resolve to continue to be angry at him. So he's kind of angry at his servant for getting drunk. So it's kind of human nature. There's humor here. There's people getting drunk. There's arguments. So it's really interesting from that point of view. The fourth thing that I've learned is just how uneasy a time it was. There's lots of I'm not up to the Great Fire yet. I'm in 1665 in terms of my reading. But in 1661 here, we've got the Fifth Monarchist Uprising by Thomas Venner. And he said he wakes up at 6 o'clock, people running up and down, talking about the fanatics were up in arms. So he's talking about the Fifth Monarchists. I rose and went forth. When the street, I found everybody in arms at the doors, so people have got weapons. I returned, though with no good courage at all, but that I might not seem to be afeard. So he's doing this because he wants to be seen to be doing something, but he's quite afraid. And got my sword and pistol, which, however, I had no powder to charge, and went to the door, where I found Sir R. Ford, and with him I walked up and down as far as the Exchange, and there I left him. In our way, the streets full of trained band and great stories what mischief these rogues have done, and I think near a dozen have been killed this morning on both sides. Seeing the city in this condition, the shops shut, and all things in trouble, I went home and sat, it being office day, until noon. So talking about people being out, being afraid, being worried about this kind of uprising, which of course doesn't succeed, it gets crushed. But just this idea that it was quite uneasy, 1660s, following the period of the Republic, there was still a great kind of worry that things could go back to how they were in the very, very unstable time of the Republic and the war. And then finally, the fifth thing that I've really picked up on is this time of great economic change and new goods coming in into London. And in September 1660, Samuel Pepys says, I sent for a cup of tea, a China drink, which I'd never drank before, and went away. So he's trying tea for the first time. So this trade is increasing, new consumer goods available. In 1661, he talks about signing this contract between the governors of the East India Company and the monarch. And so this is a period of kind of, it's not the beginning of empire, obviously that's before this, but really this period of it growing, and companies like the East India Company, the Royal African Company are really kind of developing, and Pepys is part of that kind of circle. So it's quite interesting to, often we think about the empire being a kind of Victorian thing, but actually prior to that, the roots of it in the 1660s, the development there. So I find it really interesting. If you don't have time to read, all these books of Samuel Pepys' diary, but you're interested in Pepys and his life, I would recommend this biography by Claire Tomalin called Samuel Pepys, The Unequalled Self. It's a really, really good read. You'll get a really excellent understanding of Samuel Pepys, and it goes into detail about his life. Prior to his diary, he had the quite famous operation to take out a kind of a stone in his bladder, I think it was, which was really, really, quite difficult reading from the 21st century point of view, but you find out all about that in this book. It's a really, really well written book. And if you're interested in the restoration, I'd strongly recommend it. So I hope that was useful. If you've got any questions, or if you've had a look at this and you've got any thoughts on Samuel Pepys, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for listening.